Hello there, and welcome to the clay class of My Art Stash subscription box. First of all, thank you so much for subscribing and getting our monthly box. We hope that you have really been enjoying it. If it's your first box, yay, you're in for a big treat because this month we have sent you home with some raw clay. So this is low fire earthenware clay. It will fire to a bright, clean white once it's fired in the kiln. It does have to come back to us to be fired in the kiln, and then you can either paint with acrylic paint for a matte finish, and so that you don't have to come back yet again to glaze it, because if you use glazing, then it's going to get shiny and glossy in the kiln, and it requires a second firing. So what we're going to be doing in this project is making a cute little bunny figurine. So complete with a head, a body, bunny tail, and 2 ears. And so I'm going to walk you through this. The bunny is hollow, and he will need some refining after he dries up a little bit. So, and I'll show you guys how to do that as well. So he's not quite finished yet, but you start with a ball of clay, and what we have sent you is enough for the whole project. So you're gonna want to pinch off some for the head and head, tail, and ears. The body needs to be just slightly bigger, so you don't want them even. You want them to be like maybe 2/3 and 1/3. So break your clay up into that. And then you just kind of spend some time slapping the clay around. I'm cupping my hands and I'm kind of slapping the ball of clay into the cupped rounded portion. And what that's doing is it's kind of forcing the clay to become a round ball. So I'm turning it every so often. And there's gonna be a few cracks in there, and that's not a big deal. You can kind of just smooth those out. Like I said, clay is not able to be refined to its best refinement until it's pretty dry and can support itself. So this is a pretty good start. I could even have taken away just a little bit more of this clay, but we want to start with a pinch pot. And so basically we're just going to kind of stick our thumb into the clay. My other hand is encouraging the ball to keep its ball shape. And so I'm just gonna you're kind of gauging it. You don't want to go through the clay, obviously, but you don't want to only push in just a little bit. You're trying to go most of the way through because we want the rim and body of this bunny to be the same thickness, or at least as close as possible to the same thickness. Let me grab one of these other bunnies. I've wet them down so much to clean them off. So when you look inside the bunny, you want to be able to see there's a little thin spot right there. So that would be a weakness area. But other than that, you could pretty much see even up in there, he's not very, there's not a lot of clay in any one spot up there. And what that's going to do is help him dry very evenly and prevent any issues with the water and cracking, explosions in the kiln. Clay has to get very, very dry before it can be fired in the kiln. So you want to help that out by getting the clay as thin as possible with it still being self-supportive, so that it has as much surface area as possible to dry. So you can also kind of cup once you get it out like this. You kind of stick your finger up in there and pull some of that clay from the bottom back up the rim. So that kind of helps you keep it nice and even the very bottom of your pinch pot. And I've kind of made a tall one at this point. We can kind of put him down so you can see the difference between this one's very round and tall. And so I'm going to kind of squish it back down and kind of coax it. Clay's going to go where you tell it to go. So I'm going to kind of coax it with my hands outward as I'm pushing down. But you have to be gradual with clay. You cannot force it quickly. It's gonna go where you tell it to go, but you have to just very gradually. So just a little bit at a time, I've kind of turned it into an oblong shape versus the round shape that we had before. And so now I'm pretty happy with this bunny body. So I'm gonna set that to the side, and then I'm gonna grab the bigger ball that we had, and then I'm gonna pinch off like a little, I don't know, maybe a little bit smaller than a golf ball size off of that. And this is gonna be our head. So it's a, you know, inside my palm. I'm trying to think what this would be. Ping pong ball, maybe, okay? And I've just made it round. And then the important thing to remember with clay is that when you have two pieces and they're wet and you just kind of smush them together, they're gonna feel like you've stuck them together. But as this dries, there's nothing to hold these two pieces of clay together because they're just, that water is what's making it sticky. And so it will just fall apart. It's very, very important. If you only listen to one part of this video, this is the most important part. You absolutely have to do some score marks. So this is kind of like tic-tac-toe. You're roughing it up. Think about when you're painting old furniture, you have to rough up the surface with sandpaper, right? This is the same principle. And just for extra measure, I mean, sometimes you can get away with one side, but it can be better to do both sides. Then you want to take like a paintbrush or even just your finger, take a little bit of water, and you just tap, tap, tap some water into those pieces, those lines. What this does is it creates a little bit of slip, watery clay, and that acts as glue. And then you take and you put those score marks and you give it some gentle wiggles until you feel it locking in place and it's not wiggling anymore, okay? So we very much have a turtle right now, but I just wanna elaborate a little bit more on the importance of scoring, because when you've just got two pieces of clay, there's nothing bonding those two pieces together, okay? So if you make score marks, all right, and push those two pieces together, you've bonded them a little bit, and then when you wiggle, you're locking those into place, and so it's nice and sturdy. You've got that strong bond, okay? So now that we've wiggled it together, now we can kind of take our fingers, and so I'm gonna try and hold this so where you guys can see it, because I have made about 7 of these already, and I have found that this is the best way to get a bunny face shape and be happy with it, bunny head shape. So I've got my hands wrapped around the bunny and my thumb on the bunny head, and I'm gonna kind of push the clay backwards and smooth it out to the back. And I'm gonna do this kind of all the way around. And I wanna keep the bunny, the reason why my hands are all the way around it is because like you wanna keep the bunny, when you push it, tends to like flatten out this way and get rounder. You wanna keep it oblong, and so that's kind of what your hands are there to guide it for. And so if he starts to flatten out, just kind of tuck him back in. All right, and so we look like this right now, okay? So your hands are your tools for this project. There's no right or wrong. It's kind of just one of those things like you keep playing with it until you get it right. If your clay starts to dry, then you can, you know, add a little bit of water with a sponge or a spray bottle or something like that. If you start to get a lot of cracking, the more you play with it, the more it is gonna dry out. But you can kind of just put some water on it, wrap it up in a plastic bag or some saran wrap overnight, and it will re-wet and be, you know, you can pick it back up tomorrow, or just plop it into a bowl if you really want to start all over. You know, plop it in with a bowl of water and it will completely turn back into just dirt and mud. You might even have to do a little bit of like letting it, you can't add too much water, and or it'll just turn back to mud and you won't be able to play with it anymore. So maybe not do that, but if you spray it down and cover it up, it should get back to where you can work with it moist. All right, so still turtle-esque, it's getting there. the reason also I like to kind of push in the bottom part of the head and make sort of like a pointier head versus like a roundish head. So the bottom of the head is going to be a little bit kind of, it's going to be kind of like egg shaped, with the top of the egg being the bottom of the head actually, if that makes any sense. So it's kind of like getting wider as we come up. Okay. I haven't added any water to my hands. My clay is still pretty nice and moist, and I've had this out for a while. So hopefully y'all's clay is still pretty malleable. If you start to see major cracking, just wet it just a little, your fingertips barely. It's easier to continue adding water than to let it dry out. And I think I'm pretty happy with this. I might kind of continue tweaking here and there as we add our ears on. But overall, I think it's okay. This stage always looks like a dinosaur or some weird turtle or something like that. So just want to show you guys how weird mine looks too. So just set this guy aside and move on to making your ears. And I think you can push through the whole self-doubt that might come along with this stage. So the next step is to take the remainder of your clay, work it into a ball again. So I'm just kind of like smushing it into my cupped hand, rolling it so that we get a ball, right? And then I'm gonna roll back and forth instead of round and around, and I'm gonna start coaxing this clay into a coil, which is a fancy word for what you probably called a hot dog or a worm in art class in elementary school. When you last played with clay, hopefully not when you last played with clay. We have clay classes in the studio about once a month, and I'm obsessed. I just found a video called The Great Pottery Throwdown on HBO Max. So see how this is cracking? That's not a really big deal. You don't want to continue to stress it and when it's cracking like that without kind of wiping those out. So you stretch it a little bit and then you can add a little bit of water. Stretch it and add a little bit of water. Just the tiniest little bit on your finger goes a long way. So, and stretch and wiping it with that water also kind of like pulls it. And if you get thick and thin like I am, just concentrate on just the thick areas and get it to the same thinness as the rest, because we want it to be a little bit consistent. This is probably way too long. I've been talking. So ideally you want it about 4 inches, maybe 5. And then you want to cut it in half so that you have kind of 2 even, these are going to be the ears. Yeah, I've kind of made mine too thin. So this is a little thin. So you probably want it about the width of your big finger here. I should have left it. So I'm going to smush mine back down a little bit. So use your big finger as your guide. And it's okay if after you cut these in half now, we want one side to maybe be thicker than the other because the ears have a natural taper, right? So as I'm smushing mine back down, it's kind of creating that for me. But you can do that by kind of just like taking your finger and pulling the clay down. And we're kind of making, like we're flattening out the coil, really. It doesn't have to be round anymore. Then you can put it down on your work mat. And you want to put it down with the thick side away from you if you have a distinct thick and thin. And then if you don't, then this should definitely help create that, because you're just going to take your finger and you're just going to like run it down and push that clay. You're not trying to go all the way through, but you're creating this like ridge that becomes the inside of the ear. So that's that impression of the inner ear that the bunny has. So it creates that nice little ridge scooped out. And if you get some cracks like this, just take your finger and smooth them. I didn't even have to add water. And you just kind of smooth out the clay as best you can. Don't worry too much if it's looking like this right now. Like I said, refinement of clay comes as it's drying, and probably not with your fingers. And then you can like bring the clay up in between your fingers into a point on the end if you want. All right. And then I like to take something kind of round, and you can kind of encourage a little bit more depth even into the bottom of the ear there. And then decide, is this your left ear or right ear? Because that's gonna decide how you taper this, because I like to take one side. So if this is my left ear, I'm gonna take this and like pinch it at an angle this way, because this part needs to stick out on the head. So see how I kind of angled this so that the head, when it sits on the head, the ear kind of points upwards now. Okay, and just play with that a little bit. I'm scoring again, a little bit of water, and I'm gonna come to the head, and just at the crest of the top of the head, I'm gonna wiggle this on. And you can kind of smush the clay into the head to sort of make it look like, kind of hide that joint. And if your clay doesn't stand up on its own, don't worry, you can lay it down. Or if you like for it to stand up, just set your ear aside on your mat, let it dry for a couple minutes, 10 minutes maybe. You want to keep checking on it, don't let it go too far until it can be self-supporting. Okay, as clay dries, it becomes more and more self-supporting. So see how it's flopping a little bit. So as I'm moving it around, so you kind of have to coax it back. So it becomes more and more self-supporting, and it'll stand up straight on its own after it dries a little bit. So you can just be kind of patient and set it down to the side if you want it to stand up like that. So I like to have one standing up, and then we're gonna repeat the process, and we're going to make another ear, and this one I like to lay flat. So I'm gonna kind of flatten it a little bit again. I'll turn my bunny. I'll put the thick part away from me, and I'm gonna take my finger and I'm gonna push it down to create the ridge. Whoop. Take my other finger and kind of create some resistance like this. That helped a lot. Don't get too thin. Clay that's too thin is never gonna really self-support, and it's gonna get brittle really fast. All right, so this taper has to go the other way because this is the opposite ear. So I've got the taper facing this way. I'm going to score again, and then a little bit of water. Oh, all right, so I want to lay this one down. So I'm gonna gently just kind of like, I didn't create this the right way to lay down, so I'm just gonna gently force it to kind of fall. There we go. So I'm just kind of creating that, so the angle of the head now is even with the ear so that it'll lay down. Okay. All right. And since it's lying down, the more points of contact something like this, an appendage to a piece of clay, the more points of contact it has with the main body, the stronger or the less likely it is that it's gonna break off later. So I'm gonna actually slip and score and kind of just wiggle that onto the clay back there. I slipped and scored right here so that it's nice and strong. So if I bump it later loading in the kiln, it will stay put. So I'm just gonna, so I'm supporting the clay behind where I'm pushing. See how my thumb's behind my finger? So whenever you push and pull on clay, if you don't want it to go through, kind of always have to be thinking about how you're supporting it while tweaking it once it's kind of put together. So you can even make those ears kind of bump up to each other so that they kind of support each other if you wanted to. And now you can kind of go back and tweak. He got kind of flattened out, so I'm gonna kind of like squish him back together. And I'm pretty happy with that. He's kind of elongated. He could be a little bit less plump.